In the cavernous lecture hall of the University of Michigan, a low buzz of murmured conversations drifted through the air like the hum of a distant hive, mingling with the rustle of pages being turned in weathered notebooks and the staccato clicks of laptop keyboards as students settled into their seats, their movements a choreography of habit honed over weeks of routine. It was just another Tuesday morning. Yet this was no ordinary gathering, for this was Professor Evelyn Harper's advanced calculus class, a proving ground notorious across the sprawling campus not merely for the dizzying complexity of its subject matter but for the formidable, almost tyrannical presence of the woman who commanded it, Evelyn Harper herself, who entered the room with the crisp, unyielding authority of a conductor stepping before an orchestra, her sharp features etched with determination, framed by a pair of silver-rimmed glasses that caught the harsh glare of the overhead lights, her brown hair pulled back into a tight, disciplined bun that revealed a high forehead and a pair of eyes so piercing they seemed to cut through the very fabric of the room, a gaze that carried not just observation but an unspoken ultimatum: meet her standards or be found wanting. Her reputation was a monument carved from years of exacting precision and an ironclad discipline that brooked no compromise. In her classroom, there were no lifelines, no gentle encouragements, no allowances for weakness. To pass her course was to earn it through raw, unadulterated merit, and on this particular morning, as she strode to the front of the hall, the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels against the cold tiled floor reverberated like the ticking of a clock counting down to an inevitable reckoning. She paused at the lectern, her fingers deftly snapping a piece of chalk in two with a single, deliberate motion. A sound so sharp it sliced through the ambient noise, and instantly, the room fell into a silence so profound it was as if every breath had been collectively held. "All right," she declared, her voice a blade of clarity cutting through the stillness as she brushed a stray strand of brown hair from her angular face. "Last lecture we covered multivariable limits, today we advance to Laplace transforms." She offered no preamble, no softening of the transition, simply turned to the expansive whiteboard behind her, her hand moving with the speed and certainty of a seasoned artist, long, intricate equations unfurling across the surface in a script so perfect it seemed almost mechanical, a cascade of symbols and numbers that wove together into a tapestry of mathematical elegance. The students before her erupted into a flurry of activity, pencils racing across paper in a frantic bid to capture every detail, some already losing their way amid the dense forest of notation, their eyes darting between the board and their notes in a quiet, desperate panic. Others maintained a facade of comprehension, nodding along with practiced ease though their clenched jaws and furrowed brows told a different story. Evelyn reveled in this chaos, the struggle that unfolded before her, the palpable tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break, the silent, unspoken competition that pulsed beneath the surface as each student vied not to fall behind. She knew the majority would buckle under the weight of her expectations, their minds buckling beneath the relentless pace and complexity she demanded, and deep down, she preferred it that way. It was a filter, a crucible that separated the merely capable from the truly exceptional, reinforcing her long-held conviction that only the brightest, the most resilient, the most gifted minds belonged in her rarefied world, a realm governed by the unforgiving laws of logic and numbers where anything less than excellence was an affront. Amid this sea of straining faces and scribbling hands, one student sat apart, unnoticed by most, positioned near the middle of the hall in a row neither too close to the front nor too far back, his pen tapping lightly against the edge of a notebook whose corners had begun to curl from use. He wasn't scrambling to keep up, wasn't gripped by the same frantic energy that consumed his peers. If anything, he appeared almost bored. His name was Ethan Carter, a tall, lean figure with an unremarkable presence, always dressed in a simple gray hoodie and faded jeans that hung loosely on his frame. He was the sort of person who faded into the background, rarely speaking in class, never raising his voice or drawing attention with bold gestures, yet beneath that quiet, unassuming exterior burned a mind of extraordinary caliber, an intellect that processed numbers and patterns with a clarity and speed that set him apart, though few in the room would have guessed it. To Ethan, equations weren't mere strings of symbols to be memorized or wrestled into submission, they were living things. Intricate webs of meaning that spoke to him in a language he'd understood since childhood. He glanced up at the board now, his dark eyes tracing the sprawling equation Evelyn had just etched across its surface, and he saw it instantly, a flaw, a small but unmistakable error nestled in the second line where she'd misapplied the transformation, shifting a term prematurely and throwing off the coefficient's alignment. It was subtle, the kind of mistake that might slip past most, but to Ethan, it stood out like a crack in a mirror. He hesitated, his pen pausing mid-tap as he weighed his options. He could let it go, ignore it, no one else seemed to have noticed, and pointing it out risked disrupting the lecture's momentum. But then again, if Evelyn caught it later, and she might, given her meticulous nature, she'd likely halt everything to backtrack, wasting time on a correction that could have been avoided. A minor inefficiency that grated against his instinct for order. Before he could settle on a course of action, a hesitant hand rose from the front row, a girl with a slight frame and a voice that wavered as she spoke. Professor Harper, I think there's an error in the second line." Her words hung fragile in the air, tinged with uncertainty. Evelyn turned slowly, deliberately, one eyebrow arching upward as if the suggestion itself was an insult to her very being. "An error," she repeated, her tone carrying a faint undercurrent of disdain. She pivoted to face the board, her eyes sweeping over her own work with the confidence of someone who rarely, if ever, doubted herself. Then she smirked, a thin, tight expression that didn't reach her eyes. "There is no error," she said flatly, dismissing the girl with a flick of her wrist. The student's face flushed a deep crimson, her head dipping as she shrank back into her seat, the sting of humiliation evident in the way her shoulders curled inward. Ethan exhaled softly through his nose, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. He despised this, the way some professors wielded their authority like a cudgel, brushing off students as if their observations were inherently unworthy, acting as though their own work was infallible, a pedestal of perfection no one could touch. And before he could rein in the impulse, his hand was in the air, rising steady and sure. "Actually," he said, his voice calm, measured, slicing through the faint ripple of surprise that followed the girl's retreat, "there is an error." The room seemed to shift, a subtle but palpable change as heads turned, eyes widening, a collective intake of breath as attention swung toward this unassuming figure who dared to challenge the indomitable Evelyn Harper. Her expression didn't falter immediately, but for a fleeting second, a spark of irritation flared in her gaze, quickly masked by a veneer of composure. "Oh," she said, crossing her arms over her chest, her tone deceptively light, almost playful, though the edge beneath it was unmistakable. "Enlighten me, then." Ethan stood, not out of arrogance or to make a show, but simply because he found it easier to speak from a standing position. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as he pointed to the board with a steady hand. "It's in the second step," he explained, his voice even, devoid of bravado. "You applied the transformation to the wrong term. The coefficient doesn't carry over correctly that way. If you follow your method through to the end, the final result won't align with the expected outcome." Silence descended, thick and heavy, cloaking the room in a tension that pressed against every surface. Evelyn's jaw tightened, her fingers curling slightly around the chalk she still held. She turned back to the board, her eyes retracing her own work with a scrutiny that betrayed no hint of doubt. And then she saw it, the mistake, glaring back at her like an unwelcome guest, undeniable in its presence. For a moment, Ethan thought she might acknowledge it outright, a simple nod perhaps, an admission followed by a swift sur action, but instead, her lips curved into a tight, controlled smile, one that held no warmth. "Well, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice laced with something that hovered between sarcasm and challenge, "since you seem so confident, why don't you come up here and show us the correct way?" A scattering of muffled chuckles rose from the crowd, a few students sensing the undercurrent of her words. She wasn't conceding defeat, not yet. She refused to grant him the victory of being right without a fight. Instead, she aimed to turn the tables, to put him on display, to watch him squirm or falter under the weight of every eye in the room. It was a calculated move, a test disguised as an invitation, but Ethan wasn't rattled. He set his notebook down on the desk with a quiet thud, rose from his seat, and walked to the front with a calm that belied the stakes. He took the chalk from her outstretched hand, feeling its cool, powdery texture against his fingers, and stepped up to the board. He could sense the pressure building, the silent expectations radiating from the rows of students behind him, Evelyn's gaze drilling into his back like a physical weight, the faint whispers of classmates wondering if he was about to make a fool of himself, some perhaps hoping he would, but nerves didn't touch him, not here, not now. With smooth, deliberate strokes, he erased the incorrect portion of the equation, the chalk dust rising in faint clouds as he cleared the slate. Then he began to rewrite it. His handwriting wasn't as polished as Evelyn's, a little rougher, less refined, but that was irrelevant. What mattered was the logic, the truth beneath the symbols, and it poured from him with an ease that felt almost instinctive. The mistake was in applying the transform too early, he said as he worked, his voice steady, conversational, as if he were explaining something mundane rather than dismantling a professor's error in front of 100 witnesses. You carried the coefficient outside before adjusting the integral limits, which threw off the function's integrity, but if you solve it this way, it holds together. The room was silent save for the soft, rhythmic scratch of chalk against the board, a sound that seemed to anchor the moment. He finished the equation, every step aligning perfectly, then set the chalk down with a quiet clack, stepping back to survey his work before turning to face Evelyn. She stood rigid, her arms still crossed, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. She wasn't accustomed to this, being corrected so publicly, her authority challenged in the very space where she held absolute sway. Ethan could see it in her eyes, the flicker of resistance, the urge to dismiss him, to brush it off and reclaim her footing, but the evidence was there, stark and irrefutable, etched in white against the board. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her chest rising and falling with controlled precision, then nodded curtly. "Fine," she said, her tone sharp and clipped. "You corrected it, congratulations." The words carried no warmth, no genuine praise, just a begrudging acknowledgement, a concession wrung from her like water from a stone. Some students exchanged glances, a few raising their eyebrows in surprise that she'd yielded even that much. Ethan didn't linger on the moment. He returned to his seat, feeling the weight of his classmates' stares following him. Some looks tinged with admiration, others with a hint of irritation, perhaps assuming he was grandstanding, but he wasn't. He didn't thrive on attention, didn't seek applause. He simply couldn't tolerate errors, especially ones that could have been avoided with a moment's care. Evelyn turned back to the board, her movements brisk as she wiped away his work with a single sweeping motion, erasing his correction as if to erase the challenge itself. "Let's move on," she said, her voice regaining its commanding edge. But then she paused, her hand hovering over the chalk tray. A subtle tension in her posture. "Since Mr. Carter is so eager to contribute," she added, her words carrying a new weight, "I assume he won't mind another challenge." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the sudden pivot. "Excuse me," he said, his tone neutral but curious. Evelyn was already writing again, her hand moving with purpose as a new equation took shape, this one far longer, sprawling across half the board in a dense thicket of integrals, limits, and a particularly thorny differential component that seemed to twist in on itself. She finished with a flourish, the chalk tapping the board with a final, decisive dot, then turned to face him. "Since you have such a keen eye," she said, her smile sharp-edged, almost predatory, "solve this." A few students shifted in their seats, the air growing taut with anticipation. Ethan stared at the equation, recognizing it immediately for what it was. Not a routine problem pulled from their syllabus, but something deliberately complex, a Gauntlet thrown down with intent. This wasn't about teaching or learning anymore. It was a trap. She didn't expect him to solve it, not fully. She wanted him to hesitate, to stumble halfway through and reveal his limits, to prove he wasn't as clever as he'd just appeared, to restore the balance of power she felt slipping. He could hear the faint snickers from a few classmates, the soft rustle of anticipation as they waited for him to struggle. Evelyn smirked, stepping back and folding her arms. "Take your time," she said, her voice dripping with a condescension so thick it was almost tangible. But Ethan didn't need time. He exhaled through his nose, a slow, steady breath that grounded him, then stood once more, walking back to the board with the same calm he'd carried before. He picked up the chalk, its weight familiar in his hand, and began to write, his movements fluid, each symbol and number flowing from his mind to the board with an effortless grace that belied the problem's intricacy. He didn't pause, didn't second-guess, his brain already racing ahead, mapping the solution in his mind's eye before his hand could fully transcribe it. The room grew quieter, the murmurs fading into a hush as his work unfolded. Evelyn's smirk began to waver, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. Halfway through, he glanced at her. "I assume you want the solution in exponentials rather than trigonometric functions?" he asked, his tone neutral, a simple clarification. She didn't respond, her silence a tacit confirmation. He continued, "A few more steps, a few deft simplifications that pared the equation down to its essence, and then he was done," underlining the final answer with a single, steady line before setting the chalk back on the tray with a soft clink. The silence that followed was deep, consuming, broken only by a low whistle from a student in the back row, a sound of pure disbelief. Evelyn's expression was unreadable as she stepped forward, her eyes scanning his work line by line, searching for a flaw, a misstep, anything she could seize upon to dismiss him. But there was nothing. He'd solved it, not just correctly, but with an elegance that made the impossible seem almost effortless. A few students whispered to each other, leaning forward in their seats, grasping the significance of what they'd just witnessed. Ethan crossed his arms, standing there without a trace of a smile, without a hint of gloating, just waiting. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice tighter than before, strained at the edges. "Lucky guess," she said. A few students laughed under their breath, though the sound was directed more at her than him. He tilted his head slightly. "It wasn't a guess," he replied, his calm unshaken. Her nostrils flared as she exhaled sharply, a rare crack in her composure. "Sit down, Mr. Carter," she muttered, her words clipped and curt. He turned and walked back to his seat. But he could feel the shift in the room, the way his classmates regarded him now, some with a quiet awe, others with a flicker of resentment, and Evelyn, standing there with something else entirely simmering in her gaze, a blend of frustration and a grudging respect she refused to voice aloud. The energy had changed, irrevocably. No one was looking at her with the same reverence they'd held at the start of class. Ethan hadn't set out to undermine her, that was never his intent. But he also wasn't about to diminish himself just to preserve her pride. She turned back to the board, gripping the chalk a little tighter, her knuckles widening faintly. She resumed the lecture, her voice striving to reclaim its usual authority, but the words lacked their customary bite, falling flat against the new undercurrent in the room. Then, abruptly, she stopped mid-sentence, her hand freezing over the board as she pivoted to face the class, her eyes sweeping the rows with a deliberate slowness before settling on him once more. "If you're so confident, Mr. Carter," she said, forcing a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, "how about we raise the stakes?" A few students chuckled, a nervous edge to the sound. Others leaned forward, sensing the tension coiling tighter. Ethan didn't react immediately, his expression steady, his dark eyes meeting hers without flinching. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone even. Evelyn walked to her desk with a measured stride, pulling out a thick textbook with a faded cover, its edges worn from years of use. She flipped through it with purpose, her fingers deft as she navigated the pages, stopping on a section buried deep within, far beyond the scope of their current coursework. She turned the book around, holding it aloft so the class could see the dense, forbidding equations printed there, a wall of mathematical complexity that seemed to loom over the room. "This," she said, tapping a particularly intimidating problem with her fingertip, "is from an advanced graduate-level course, something I wouldn't expect any undergraduate to solve." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of awe and unease. Her intent was transparent. This wasn't about math anymore. It was a power play, a challenge crafted to push him beyond his limits, to make him falter in front of everyone and restore her dominance. She smiled again, her eyes sharp as shards of glass. "But since you seem to have a natural talent," she continued, her voice laced with a challenge she didn't bother to disguise, "why don't you prove it?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath a quiet anchor amid the rising storm. He saw through her maneuver, understood it for what it was. She wasn't testing his ability to solve equations, she was testing his nerve, betting he'd crack under the weight of a problem so far outside their realm. He could refuse, walk away. He owed her nothing, had no obligation to play her game. But the way the room watched him, the way some students seemed to wait for him to retreat, their eyes glinting with curiosity or doubt, it solidified his resolve. He stood, and for a fleeting moment, Evelyn's smirk faltered, a crack in her armor. He approached the front, she handed him the textbook with a flourish, but he didn't even glance at it. He'd already memorized the problem the instant she displayed it, its structure imprinting itself on his mind like a photograph. Without a word, he picked up the chalk, its familiar weight grounding him, and began to write, his movements controlled, deliberate. He knew her strategy, had seen it before in whispers about her past classes. She'd used this tactic to humble students who dared to question her, pulling out tasks just beyond their reach to remind them of their place. But she'd miscalculated with him. Ethan thrived on challenges like this. The tougher they were, the more they called to him. He started writing, the whispers in the room fading as the only sound became the steady scratch of chalk against the board. He didn't rush, didn't let the pressure dictate his pace, instead letting each step unfold naturally, flowing from one equation to the next with a precision that felt almost meditative, every transformation exact, every simplification purposeful. It was a formidable problem, no question, layers of complexity that would have broken most. But to Ethan, it was a riddle, and riddles always had answers. He worked through it, his mind a quiet storm of calculations, seeing patterns where others saw chaos, and then, finally, he boxed the final result, the solution stark and clean against the board. He turned to face the class. Silence reigned. Evelyn's face was a mask, but the tension in her jaw, the stiffness in her posture, betrayed her. She'd expected him to fail, to flounder, and give her the opening to step in, to remind everyone why she held the reins. Instead, he'd turned her trap into a triumph. A student in the back let out a low laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "What even is this guy?" he muttered, audible in the stillness. The others who doubted Ethan now stared at him differently, their skepticism giving way to something closer to respect. Evelyn's hand twitched at her side, a subtle tremor. She had to respond, had to reclaim control. "You skipped a step," she said, her voice clipped, grasping at a lifeline. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "No, I didn't," he replied, turning back to the board. He pointed to a section near the middle. "This step here, where I simplified the partial fraction decomposition." "That's what you mean." "I didn't skip it. I just did the calculation mentally because it was straightforward." The class was dead silent. Her face tightened, the lines around her mouth deepening. Ethan met her gaze. "But if you'd like, I can write it out," he added, his tone matter-of-fact, devoid of challenge, and that made it worse. He wasn't trying to undermine her, she was doing that herself through her own insistence. Evelyn inhaled sharply, her breath a hiss through her teeth. "No, that won't be necessary," she said, turning to her desk and setting the textbook down with a thud that echoed faintly, a sound of frustration masked as decisiveness. Ethan returned to his seat, the air in the room charged with an unspoken shift. He'd altered the dynamic, turned the class against her without intent. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She wouldn't let this end here. She turned back to the class. Her composure reassembled, but her grip on the desk betraying the strain beneath. Ethan settled into his chair, sensing the storm hadn't passed. Her posture was too rigid, her jaw too set. She was plotting her next move. The students, meanwhile, were still digesting what they'd seen, some exchanging glances, others whispering in low, hurried tones. Then a hand shot up from the second row. "Professor," said Brian, one of Evelyn's favorite students, leaning forward with a gleam of curiosity. "If he got it right, doesn't that mean Ethan just solved a graduate-level problem? Shouldn't that, mean something?" Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. Brian wasn't wrong, but admitting it fully would mean surrendering more ground than she could stomach. "I never said it was impossible," she replied smoothly, her voice sliding over the question like oil on water, "only that it would be difficult for an undergraduate." Her words were a dodge, a careful rewriting of the narrative to preserve her authority. Ethan stared at the desk in front of him, letting out a slow, quiet breath. He didn't need her validation, didn't hunger for her approval, but the class did. They saw the truth unfolding. Another hand rose, tentative but bold. "So if he got it right, does that mean he should be in a more advanced class?" The question lingered, heavy in the air. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, a calculation flickering behind them. Then she smiled, a softer edge to it now, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I think," she said, her voice measured, deliberate, "Mr. Carter would benefit from an academic challenge." A few students perked up, intrigued. Was she actually recognizing his talent, perhaps suggesting a leap to a higher level? Ethan wasn't convinced. His instincts told him there was more beneath the surface, which is why, she continued, walking back to her desk and pulling out a slim folder, "I'd like to invite him to a little competition." The murmurs started again, a ripple of excitement and unease. Ethan frowned, his brow creasing slightly. "What kind of competition?" he asked, his tone steady but tinged with wariness. Evelyn flipped open the folder, her fingers scanning the papers inside with practiced ease. "There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium next month," she said, her voice gaining a new cadence. "Some of the best students from schools across the region will compete. It's a rigorous, high-pressure environment, not just about solving problems but doing so under strict time constraints, with an audience of peers, professors, and experts watching." She looked up, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that pinned him in place. "I assume you'd be up for it." Ethan understood instantly. This wasn't a gift, it was a gambit. She wasn't merely testing his mathematical prowess anymore, she was testing his resilience, his ability to perform under scrutiny far beyond the confines of this classroom. If he failed, it wouldn't just be in front of his classmates, but before a broader stage of academics and prodigies, a fall that would echo. He could feel the room holding its breath, waiting for his answer. If he declined, it'd look like today was a fluke, a lucky streak, rather than skill. If he accepted, he'd have to triumph, no half measures. He exhaled, then nodded once, a single, decisive motion. "I'm in." Evelyn's smile didn't reach her eyes, a predator's grin. "Excellent," she said, but Ethan knew she wasn't done with him yet. Word of the challenge spread like wildfire. By the time he stepped out of the lecture hall, the corridors were alive with whispers, students clustering in small groups, some nodding at him with a newfound respect that felt both foreign and fleeting, others eyeing him with the curiosity reserved for an athlete before a championship, wondering if he'd rise to the occasion or crumble under the weight. Ethan barely registered it, his mind already turning to the symposium, for weeks away, for weeks to prepare for a contest that others spent months, sometimes years, honing their skills for. That night, he found himself in the campus library, a fortress of books and silence, surrounded by towering stacks of textbooks and notebooks filled with his own meticulous calculations. A half-empty coffee cup sat forgotten beside him, its contents long gone cold. He'd always loved math, ever since he was a child, puzzling out patterns in the world around him. But this was different. It wasn't just about the numbers anymore, it was personal, a test not just of intellect but of will. Burning the midnight oil already, a voice broke through his focus. He looked up to see Brian standing there, hands shoved into his pockets, a lopsided grin on his face. Brian shrugged, pulling out a chair and dropping into it across from him. Dude, you're already ahead of half the people who compete in those things. Harper's just pissed you embarrassed her. That's the only reason she threw you into this. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking faintly under his weight. I know, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Brian studied him for a moment, his grin fading into something more thoughtful. So why do it? He asked. Ethan paused, his fingers drumming lightly against the table as he considered the question. He'd asked himself the same thing more than once that day. He didn't need to prove anything, not really, could have walked away and let the moment fade into obscurity. But he knew how people like Evelyn operated, knew the game she played. If he backed down now, she'd twist it, use it as ammunition, say he was talented but undisciplined, clever but untested. She'd find a way to frame it so that his refusal became the story, not his ability. He wasn't about to let her write his narrative, because she expects me to lose, he said finally, his voice low, resolute, and I want her to be wrong. Brian's grin returned, wider this time. Now that I can respect, he said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder before leaning back in his chair. 4 weeks later, Ethan stood in a grand auditorium at the University of Pennsylvania, the air thick with anticipation, facing a panel of judges seated behind a long table, their faces stern and impassive. Above them loomed a massive digital timer, its red numbers glowing like a silent sentinel. Competitors sat at assigned desks, each equipped with scratch paper, pens, and a single, stark directive: solve the problems faster and more accurately than everyone else. Evelyn was there, seated in the audience among a sea of spectators. She'd said little to him in the weeks leading up to this, offering no guidance, no words of encouragement, just a polite nod when they'd arrived, her demeanor that of a neutral observer rather than the architect of his presence here. But Ethan knew better, knew what she was waiting for. She wanted to see him crack, to watch the pressure unravel him. The timer started with a sharp beep, and he didn't. The first round was mental math, problems to be solved without writing, pure calculation in the mind's eye. Some competitors hesitated, their fingers hovering over the response system. Ethan's hands moved without pause, punching in answers with a speed that left the proctors scrambling to verify them, his mind a whirl of numbers, each one slotting into place with a clarity that felt almost serene. The second round shifted to theoretical application, breaking down concepts into proofs. Here his intuition took over. Numbers weren't just digits to him, they were rhythms, structures that built upon one another. He saw connections where others saw walls. His pen danced across the paper, weaving logic into form. The third round was speed solving, a brutal test of endurance where pressure could unravel even the sharpest minds. But Ethan leaned into it, thriving where others faltered, ignoring the murmurs as his name crept higher on the leaderboard. By the final round, only 2 remained in serious contention, Ethan and a PhD candidate from MIT, a wiry young man with a focused intensity. The last problem appeared on the screen, a monstrous construction of nested integrals and summations, a beast designed to test not just knowledge but stamina. Ethan's pulse steadied, he exhaled, picked up his pen, and started writing. But what happened next defied expectation. The clock ticked down, each second stretching into an eternity. His fingers gripped the pen, his mind racing through the problem's layers faster than he could transcribe. Every step had to be flawless. No shortcuts, no errors. He could hear the faint scribbling of his competitor beside him, the MIT candidate matching him stroke for stroke. They were neck and neck, a duel of intellect under the unforgiving glare of the timer. Ethan's heart pounded, but his thoughts remained crystalline. He saw it then, the pattern, the shortcut no one else would spot, a subtle thread woven into the chaos. His hand moved faster, slashing through the numbers, simplifying expressions in ways that would have seemed reckless to anyone else, but he didn't need to double-check. He knew. The final answer emerged. He boxed it with a steady hand and set his pen down. The timer buzzed. He looked up, his breathing even, his rival still writing. The room was dead silent. Then one of the judges stood, walking over to examine both submissions, the tension thick enough to choke on. After a long, agonizing pause, the judge raised his microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Ethan Carter. The room exploded, some students clapping, others letting out audible gasps, a wave of sound crashing over him. Ethan exhaled, letting the reality settle. He'd won, not just against the field, but against the expectations stacked against him, against Evelyn's quiet certainty that he'd falter. She sat motionless in the crowd. Their eyes met for the first time that day, her expression uncertain, reassessing. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't scowling either. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Ethan didn't need her apology, didn't crave her approval. He'd let the numbers speak for him. The next morning, he walked into class, taking his usual seat near the middle. Evelyn entered a few minutes later, her composure as impeccable as ever, but this time, when she scanned the room, her gaze lingered on him, something different in it, respect, perhaps. She cleared her throat. "Before we begin today's lecture," she said, her voice carrying across the hall, "I'd like to acknowledge the results of yesterday's symposium. Mr. Carter took first place in a competition against some of the finest mathematical minds in the country. That is no small achievement." A few students clapped. Brian shot Ethan a knowing grin from across the room. Evelyn turned back to the board. "With that said, let's begin," she added. No fanfare, no effusion, just a statement of fact. And somehow, that simplicity carried more weight than any grand speech. For Ethan, it wasn't about her recognition. He'd needed to prove something to himself, and he had, because sometimes the truest victories weren't won with words, but with the quiet, undeniable force of action.